All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Senator Nikki Merritt, Chair of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus. We are here today to talk about how SB68 is protecting the powerful and silencing the victims. The mission of GLBC is to advocate for marginalized communities across our state. Today, the people that we're speaking up for are victims of tragedies who will not receive justice if SB 68 is passed and signed into law. In particular, we want to focus on the concerns of people who have survived sex trafficking and people who have been victims of drunk driving accidents. After the heartbreaking testimony that we all heard, and I heard myself, from sex trafficking victims, I want to point out the hypocrisy of Governor Kemp and the Republicans. They're willing to fight sex trafficking when it suits them, but they are now willing to throw those victims aside in the name of corporate profits. To get things started, I'm not going to take up too much time because we have several speakers. I would like to invite Representative Tanya Miller up to the podium to share her knowledge, and many others will share their knowledge and experience and perspective on this vital issue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. Members of the press, it's wonderful to see you here. I want to start off by thanking you for covering this very important topic, but for your willingness to share the stories of those victims who came down here bravely to testify, the world would think that this issue is all about insurance premiums and is a smart tackle of a problem or a crisis in our legal system. Well, I will tell you, coming off of a very emotional hearing this week, as a legislator who represents citizens, as a former sex crimes prosecutor in this county, it was very traumatic for me personally to sit there and watch victims stand in front of a bunch of politicians to share their stories of repeated rape, repeated sodomization, repeated beatings, repeated torture and torment at the hands of abusers, at the hands of businesses who are all but complicit in many of these crimes that would now be outlawed effectively if SB 68 passes. The fact that they had to stand up at a microphone, share the darkest days of their life, many of which occurred when they were but children, in order for legislators to understand that this is not about profits, it's not about good businesses in our communities, this is about a citizen, a victim's right to access the court and to seek justice from the jury of their peers, the same jurors who elect these representatives down here at the Capitol. What this process has revealed is that this bill is so poorly drafted that the proponents of this bill could not even articulate a scenario under which a victim of sex trafficking could go into court and make a case. Their own lawyers, who've had months to study this bill, months to deliberate on it, who have come down here and championed it, when asked a simple question, give me a hypothetical where one of these victims, who you just heard from, would be able to get justice in court. And not a single one was able to do it. This bill is gobbledygook. It makes no sense. There is no precedent for what they are trying to do to silence victims and keep them out of the courtroom. My hope as a legislator, a proud legislator in the House of Representatives, I serve proudly with friends and colleagues on both sides of the aisle who come here to work every day in an effort to vet policy, to make it the best it can be for our citizens, to consider intended consequences and unintended consequences through a process that is vigorous. And while we may ultimately agree on the policy, the process, we should all respect. What I am calling on my friends in the House of Representatives to do, whether they are Republican or Democrat, is do not abdicate our responsibility as a third and co-equal branch of government. It is our job to make the laws. Do not treat a piece of proposed legislation as if it were a royal edict. There are no kings in this state, and there are no kings in this country. I want to say, lastly, before I hand it over to my colleague, the Thelma to my Louise, that for the victims who are out there, who are watching this, and many of them are, many of them who are too afraid or too ashamed to step forward and tell you about their story for fear of being bullied or ridiculed. To the organization Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who have, through their advocacy for decades, made our state and our country and our roads more safe. Mothers Against Drunk Driving gave their opinion and their voice on this bill. They opposed it. In response, they were targeted by the governor himself. It is sad and it is unfortunate, but I want you to know that there are those of us on both sides of the aisle who are down here to stand up and stand in for you. We will not bend the knee. We will not acquiesce into any royal edicts. Our process in the House of Representatives is going to be respected. We will vet this bill, and if it is not protective of the victims and the citizens that we are sworn to protect, we will fight it until the end. Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to hand this over to my colleague, Representative Stacey Evans.
Thank you, Chair Miller. Good afternoon. I'm Stacey Evans, State Representative, District 57, City of Atlanta, legislator, mother of two, and a lawyer, member of the subcommittee of rules that's hearing this bill right now. The bill goes too far. The bill is not a balance. The bill sacrifices victims at the feet of big business. That's what it does. I do not believe that the governor and his lawyers meant it to go as far as the words on the paper make it go. I believe that our governor cares about sex trafficking victims. I believe that our governor cares about other victims of crime. And that is why I am here today with my colleagues to say we want to work with you. I know there are Republican members of the Georgia House of Representatives that want to work with him to make this bill good, because none of my colleagues standing behind me, none of my colleagues that serve with me in these chambers upstairs hate business. We're business owners. We care about victims and we care about business, but this bill does not care about both, and we want to work to make it better. So, Governor, leadership in the House of Representatives on the Republican side, let's work together to actually make balance. But make no mistake, if our governor, if our Speaker of the House, if the Republican majority does not want to work with us, with victims, with well-meaning businesses to make this bill right, we will not stop fighting. We listen to victim after victim after victim after victim over this last week. We heard horrendous stories, stories that no one would say represent a frivolous claim, stories that no one would say that's okay. And we heard their lawyer after lawyer after lawyer say, I can't bring that claim under Senate Bill 68. So if those victims are brave enough to stand up to our governor, to risk going back to that dark place, I will certainly Be brave enough to stand up to power in this building and fight for them, because they deserve nothing less. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Senator Elena Parent.
Harold Jones.
To Leader Harold Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, State Senator Harold Jones out of Augusta Minority Leader, Democratic Caucus. This should, to some extent, sound like deja vu in the sense that we have the House and the Senate both saying that they would be willing to work with the governor to try to do some good for this bill. We recognize that there ought to be certainly a balance between business and also interests of the general public. And this bill does not represent that balance at all. It is truly clear that SB68, the crux of it, really is this issue of actually foreclosing victims' access to the courtroom. It is the one area that, quite frankly, the governor has refused to actually make any changes to or make any concessions. The bill overall, we have seen, is problematic, but especially is problematic as far as cutting off victims' access to the courtroom. We've stated that within the Senate, and now we hear similar concerns in the House. And we hear concerns from the House about such a tremendous area of sex trafficking. But even that is also receiving a blind ear, a blind eye, and a deaf ear by the governor. And why is that? Because as has been stated, is that this bill is not a balance. It is totally to protect corporate interests, unfortunately. We are here to actually protect our citizens. That is the key. We need to make sure that we have a balanced bill that works for the public, works for business, and at the same time make sure we protect all of our citizens, especially those who are victims of sex trafficking. At this particular point in time, no Georgian should support SB 68. It is not good for well-meaning businesses, and it certainly is not good for the public. And with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Parent.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. I am Senator Elena Parent, and honored to serve as the chairwoman of the Senate Democratic Caucus, and I also am a proud associate member of the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus, which convened this press conference. Right now, we are in a critical juncture in this Gold Dome as the House of Representatives considers Senate Bill 68. The legislative process used by the House of Representatives has already been twisted and inverted to try to predetermine the outcome. I exhort the members of the Georgia House of Representatives, particularly my Republican friends, to not abandon the job that they have been elected to do, which is to speak for the people in their districts and not take orders from any particular group and not to take orders from the executive branch, because the legislature is a co-equal branch of government. Our responsibility as legislators to the people of Georgia must outweigh political expediency. It would be a grave mistake and a dereliction of duty for legislators to push forward a sweeping tort reform package when there are alarming developments occurring just over our southern border in Florida related to the tort reform package that they passed only a year or 2 years ago. In Florida, new reports and legislative hearings have revealed disturbing allegations that major insurers may have manipulated their accounting practices and taken advantage of regulations using subsidiaries to hide profits while simultaneously lobbying the Florida legislature for tort reform on the basis of financial distress, that if the allegations that the legislature is now demanding an investigation into are true, were 100% false. They were crying poor after 2 major hurricanes, claiming they were going to have to leave the state, and the allegations are they funneled money to subsidiaries to hide it and actually were extremely profitable at the exact same minute that they were twisting their numbers in order to get the tort reform they sought to be even more profitable in the state of Florida. Florida lawmakers are currently outraged, furious that they were lied to, not made aware of an investigation that was ongoing during tort reform as to these potential deceptions. And now they are demanding answers and re-examining these very foundations of the arguments that led them to pass their tort reform package in the first place. And yet here in Georgia, we are being asked to pass a sweeping tort reform package based on the exact same premise, that businesses and consumers' insurance rates have all risen due to lawsuits and lawsuit abuse. How could we responsibly move forward when we have not examined whether insurers in our own state might be engaging in these questionable practices that are unfolding in Florida? How could we, in good conscience, put all of the burden of rising insurance rates on victims, denying them their day in court, and even before these reports in Florida, not ask really tough questions of the insurance industry? And now it would be willful blindness to rush this bill through without asking these very tough questions about the insurance industry and what their accounting practices are right here in our great state of Georgia. We cannot place the burden on injured Georgians who only seek fair compensation for their injuries and crimes and harms against them. We must demand accountability out of every player in this judicial system. If we fail to do so, we have abandoned our own duties, and we risk making the same mistake that Florida's legislators now so regret. Let's not betray the trust of every Georgian who relies on us to speak for them and to legislate with integrity. If we rush this bill through now without getting answers to these critical questions, it will reveal this effort for what it is: a flawed premise, a sweeping bill closing the door of justice to Georgians that is based on a complete lie and fabrication, which is that insurance companies can't profitably operate in the state of Georgia, and that's why they're raising everyone's rates. Thank you for being with us today. Who's that? And now I'll turn it over to Miguel.
Good afternoon. Attorney Miguel Dominguez. I represent plaintiffs in lawsuits that seek to protect and get the full value of the lives of injured, catastrophically injured, and victims in this state. And I'm here to tell you, as someone that represents that group and someone who has spent a lot of time reading SB68, there is not one iota of that bill that deals with what the proponents of this bill says it's supposed to do in lowering insurance premiums. Not one iota of it deals with that. If the people of the good state of Georgia were coming to this Capitol outraged because of the increasing prices or cost of educating our children here in the state of Georgia, what you wouldn't see is a bill proposed to restrict the access of our children to school. What you would see is some bills trying to figure out how to lower that cost. This bill only seeks to restrict the least of us, the folks who are in most need of a voice to advocate on their behalf, access to the judicial system. And we should all be outraged by this diabolical bill. I won't refer to it as anything else because there is language in the bill that even your average attorney has problems really identifying how this affects people who are injured and victims because of the way it's written. Let me share this with you because I wanted to bring you all a client of mine today that actually could tell the story of how bad this bill is and who it really affects way better than I ever could. But I couldn't bring myself to have a victim of a sexual assault come and have to tell her story more than she already has. So I'll tell it for her just to make a very powerful example of who this bill absolutely and will affect. I have a client right now, we've been in litigation for years, that was a homeless woman, 65 years of age. One of us, a citizen of this state, who was minding her business, eating a sandwich that someone had given her in front of a Walmart, when a gentleman came up to her preaching the good news of the word, of the scripture. And because it was Christmas Eve and it was cold outside, he convinced my client that she should come back with him to a motel that he was staying at right next door so that she could get out of the cold and have a warm meal. And my 65-year-old client made it clear to him that if he was a true believer and a man of faith and knew for a fact that there would be no sex involved in this relationship, in this help that she would agree to, that she would go back with him. What happened next was that when she got inside of that hotel that's still in business here in this state, in the metro Atlanta area, he then tried to have sex with her. And because she refused, he snatched off her clothes and beat her to a pulp. When she continued to defend herself from this violation, he finally gave up and threw her naked body out of the room in front of the hotel, and in so doing, locked himself out of his own room. He was so confident that this hotel would do absolutely nothing about the condition that my client was in laying out there, that he went down to the lobby in the hotel, got security to come up and let him back into his room with my client laying on the floor. And when they got to the room and security saw my naked client beat up and battered on that ground, the security guard asked the perpetrator, "Does this belong to you? Does this belong to you?" And then let the perpetrator back into his room, held the door, while the perpetrator dragged my powerless, naked client by the wrist back into the room. When they were back in that room, the perpetrator told my client, "You see, this is the kind of place where you could kill somebody and nobody would care." For the next 36 hours, that physical assault turned into a rape. And my client was repeatedly raped and assaulted to the point where her neck was broken. My client is in a wheelchair today. And in a couple of months from now, God willing, some good people like you all from this state will hear this case. They will hear these facts that you've just heard, and they will decide what her ordeal is worth. And when that verdict comes back for way more than the insurance company wishes to pay, they'll be out here saying nuclear verdicts. But what they won't tell you is that Miguel Dominguez had to send out a demand letter early on demanding the policy limits for this fact pattern that you just heard, and that it's been denied over and over again, and that the insurance company themselves have opened themselves up to a quote-unquote nuclear verdict. But you won't hear that part of the story, so I'm here to tell you. This is a diabolical bill. It does not have the best interests of our people at heart, and it needs to be opposed at every step of the way or substantially amended, period.
Thank you, Miguel, for that, for sharing your client's story. I wish we could hear more of these horrific stories and how victims will be impacted if SB 68 passes. SB 68 is not good for our victims who need to seek justice. It gives cover to businesses that should be held accountable. It's not good for our citizens here in this state. And I call on, in this legislature, a more bipartisan, a better solution than SB 68. We all need to come to the table, as been highlighted, to come up with a better solution. And I ask the members of this legislative body to reject SB 68 in its form, as it is now. And with that, we're going to end the press conference. We're going to open up for questions. I may have to default to some of my attorneys that are here, or some, but we're open for questions.
Absolutely. There are amendments, and they've been shared, and we'll continue to share them, and we'll continue to work on them. Immediately, I can tell you there's a lot of sections. I think there's 8 substantive sections, but we've discussed amendments relating to this bifurcation of trials. This bill says mandatory. If somebody wants 2, if not 3 phases of a trial, they get it. Georgia law says you should ask for that, and if the judge thinks it makes sense, then he can give it. We could set down some parameters for a judge to have to consider when he's doing that. We've offered amendments related to how much the jury will hear about insurance from both sides. For a bill that has so much to do with insurance rates, the proponents of this bill only want the jury to know about one side of insurance, and that's the victim. They don't want anybody to know that businesses that acted badly, drivers that were driving under the influence or recklessly, that they've got insurance to make them whole. They don't want the jury to know that. So we've got amendments around that. We've got, for every section, we've offered ways to compromise on this and have offered to even go further than I know some of us would like to go in the interest of getting something better, because this is disastrous. I'm hopeful.
Okay. And with that, we're going to end. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Good job.
That's fine. No, it's fine. This thing is, I need a new